I ventured into these questions and this project in particular because I was interested in the potential in creolization as a philosophical method and a way of posing certain question sets around what it means for marginalized communities in general, but in particular, communities of Black people, uh, to etch out spaces and practices of freedom within the context of or against the backdrop of anti-Black violence, or within the context of or against the backdrop of settler colonial violence. And so, in this specific um, call, I should say, to creolize the nation, what I'm trying to offer is creolization as a methodology and a way of reading and thinking about these questions, to offer creolization as a frame through which we can talk about and think about nation. And by nation, I mean a national community, or what it feels like to experience and be part of the nation, sort of on the ground. Um, to use creolization as a way to think about and talk about nation um, as in order to foreground those sort of everyday practices of figuring out how to be free in the context of these kinds of violences. So that's a sort of broad stroke of what the book is trying to do.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And I think some of the language you use, figuring out this kind of sense of ongoing or process that's not fixed. We could discuss this later with some of the influences and the concept of creolization you're working with. It's very interesting, the mobility, we might say, there. One of the things you also talk about in the book, you have this kind of back and forth with staying with the nation as a form of community for all of its problems. You discuss Paul Gilroy's concept of the diaspora, how he's thinking through that, for instance, but still end up arguing for this creolized nation. I understand your push here to be strategic or practical. One of the things you said that stuck with me, I'll quote here, that the nation form will more than likely continue to be the organizing frame for the political, economic, and sociocultural aspects of our lives. So could you talk more about this choice kind of from the beginning to tarry with the nation as a form instead of abandoning it for something else like the diaspora or the other alternatives you consider?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you're right to point out that I do make space in the book to engage with Paul Gilroy's work around this question of diaspora, and particularly around how the complex relationship between or among diaspora and these sort of transnational coalitions and communities, and the Black diaspora, right? So, and I think you're right in picking up this sort of strategic thread of this proposal to creolize the nation, because that's definitely the case. Part of why I decided to stay within this frame. But there's also this other piece um, to my move to bring creolization within the nation frame, and I think that this other piece has perhaps less to do with the nation, and again, more to do with what I really want to do in the book, right? Which is to say, what I really want to do in the book is to foreground, like I said earlier, a set of technologies or poetics, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
that I think creolization has to offer, right? So that in attending to this creolizing poetics, what I want to say is we don't have to move beyond the nation frame, right? And I think in a move that perhaps too quickly abandons the nation in favor of diaspora would be tantamount to missing this opportunity to see the ways in which this creolizing poetics, or to see what this creolizing poetics has to offer us to help us think about the nation frame and talk about the nation frame differently. So, I mean, I could say more about what I mean by that, but I don't know if you want to
I would
comment.
love actually to hear more. Sort of, you use words poetics, technology. The
Right.
elaboration would be interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess I want to first say that, like you said, I favor nation over diaspora. Um, but so given that what the book is trying to do to offer creolization, this particular set of poetics and imaginary that allows us to think about and to theorize about notions of subject and place and community in very different ways, right? And so, given that that's what I'm trying to do in the book, um, nation is the frame within which um, that allows me to make those kinds of arguments, if you will. So thinking in terms of diaspora, is most vital for certain kinds of questions around decolonization, for instance, and for effective resistance against anti-blackness, right? The diaspora allows us to think in these transnational terms, and I kind of open that space in that section of the book where I bring in Fanon. But my decision to opt for nation, as it were, and to work out movements of what creolizing the nation would look like is really about being able to say that nation is not what we often think it means, given that, to my mind at least, not sufficient attention is paid to these alternative poetics and practices that creolization consists of.
One of the words you used in your first response to my question was coalition, which you've written about extensively before outside of this book. This is an opportunity to bring some of that in. Maybe this is one of these poetics or practices you have in mind in your answer, because something I found novel of your other writings on coalition, specifically what you're calling decolonial coalitions, is the relevance of play, playfulness that I understand you're drawing on Maria Lugones and others. So this is another generative kind of juxtaposition. What does play give the national communities you're calling for?
Right. I appreciate this question because it's this invitation for me to talk about how in the book I'm working very squarely within and with Glissant and thinking through the frame of creolization. But what I do in the book is try to curate a conversation, if you will, or an encounter between Latina feminism and creolization as a theory. And so, like you said, Maria Lugones' work is very much a part of that middle section, that middle work of the book. But in any event, so my thinking around the category of playfulness is, to go to Maria Lugones' work, in particular, her development of this notion of playful world travel, to say that, or to show how, there's this very interesting resonance, and resonance in a way that is perhaps political in ways that Glissant's work is not. But in any event, what I want to say, or what I show in the book, is that Lugones' development of this notion of playful world travel resonates in really interesting ways with how Glissant talks about his notions of errantry, an archipelago as a mode of thinking, the ways in which he grounds movement and dynamism, the movement of the rhizome when it comes to the coming into being of the composite community. And so ultimately, I see playfulness as a part of what it would mean to develop these kinds of sensibilities or imaginaries, if you will, against the politics of purity, right? Which is the
Hmm.
term that Lugunis uses to sort of mark the rot, as it were, at the center of coloniality, which is to say that, for her, grounded in this attitude of play, one's community building practices become open, right, to, well, a kind of openness, right, to a kind of uncertainty that comes with the lived dynamism um, of moving in the world as human and with other human beings, right? And we might think of this lived dynamism in terms of the impurity that comes with that is necessarily a part of this moving plurality, right? On all sorts of levels, right? The everyday level, the cultural level, the political level, and so, there's this one piece that I wrote. I think it came out in either 2018 or 2019, where in the piece I think about the ways in which Glissant's his poetics, right, his account of errantry is both against the roots thinking of purity
Hmm.
and as a consequence has opacity as its conceptual center. I suspect that we will probably say more things about opacity as this conversation unfolds. So I won't say too much about opacity right now. But what I do want to say is that as a mode of world traveling and as a mode of community building and relation, playfulness is this thing that I think captures an orientation that rejects a kind of totalizing kind of knowing, right? Knowledge for the sake of capture, um, in this sense, is not a prerequisite for moving in the world, right? And that's because the playful world traveling subject is one for whom it makes sense to build with the other as that other remains irreducible to whatever concepts or frames that would have reduced her to some colonial, universality. Um, and so it's at this
Hmm.
point, to my mind, that we hear an invitation to at least think with Glissant's notion of errantry,
Hmm.
or with his notion of the errant thinker as one who, I think this is either a quote or a paraphrase, right? Glissant says the errant thinker who challenges and discards the universal. Um, and so, yeah. And so, but all of that in a way that is ultimately quite grounded in material history, right? So playfulness, um, not to convey a kind of frivolous disregard of history, right? A playfulness that's actually, perhaps paradoxically quite serious, right, about the stakes of history and the materiality of history, and its attendant violences.
Hmm. So, is there something the playfulness gives the coalition that it would break down otherwise, or is it working against a seriousness, or is it working against an idea that I know who I am and that defines me in a clear way? And in fact, histories are more complicated, or how do you see in the kind of coalition itself the playfulness working?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so yeah. So all of that, right? So I think in kind of foregrounding this concept of play, it's an opportunity to build and think again without this need to capture, right? Without this
Hmm.
need to freeze in rigidity. That perhaps does get us to at least a more decolonial path in our coalition building projects. And so, to be clear, Lugones herself, as she develops this, she wants to say that this more decolonial path needs to actually be playful in this sense, right? Open to what is radically new or radically otherwise, open to sabotaging what is old and familiar and grounding, right? Which is to say, the old and familiar colonial structures that continue to ground our everyday experiences, and sort of, openness. Play allows us to be open in the sense to moving beyond the organizing limitations of coloniality.
This is a good time. I like to read from the books a little bit as some lines, just to give the audience a sense of the tone and out of sort of recognition of the work. So let me read some of your lines on this. I have a question in mind. You say, this is in the time in chapter 2, the time and place of creolization, 5960, you say. It is possible to imagine creolization as a theoretical accounting for the possibility of new and decolonial articulations of national community and national identity. So help me understand these lines. What is the kind of sense of the new that is at play here, and then how is creolization decolonial?
Right, good. I have to say, I still have to kind of grow accustomed to hearing my own words read back to me. That is still disorienting in all sorts of ways. Right. So as I hear this question, your question about, how we should think about creolization, or how I would like us to think about creolization with respect to decolonization and decoloniality. What immediately comes to mind, both when I was writing the book and now, actually, what immediately comes to mind is, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's, admonition, if you will, that decolonization is not a metaphor, right? And so at the outset, I do want to say that I don't want to offer creolization as decolonization, right? And as a matter of fact, much of the concluding sections of the book, in those sections, I try to at least begin some serious wrestling with the implications of, the migratory and diasporic experiences and conceptions of homemaking and placemaking, how to think about all of that in the context of the kinds of settler colonial violence and genocidal violence that First Peoples experienced, that then allows for these sorts of migratory and diasporic ways of being in the world, if you will. So what I offer in the book is not at all that creolization is decolonization, because I'm attentive to all the things that decolonization is actually going to hold us accountable to. But what I do offer in the book is creolization as a set of frameworks or as a method that might prepare us for, at the very least, being able to participate in these decolonizing projects, right? That might rid us of these organizing frames and technologies of the subject, of the human, that continues to reproduce coloniality and its more, recent and adaptive variants. So creolization is what might open up these sort of imaginary or imaginative avenues, if you will, that would make decolonizing practices more legible or more possible to imagine, right, in our current and decolonial now, if you will. And so, there's a book that that I read alongside writing my own book. I think it came out in 2018 by Michael Weidorn. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But in any event, I mean, so your question actually brings to mind the title of that book. And so the title of the 2018 book is, To Think Like an Archipelago, right? And so I think that's what creolization, or at least that's how I understand creolization and how I talk about it in the book, right? As a frame that asks us to think like an archipelago, right? And so what would that consist of, right? How would thinking like an archipelago put us on the way to decolonization, this way of phrasing, right? This on the way to decolonization is something I'm actually borrowing from a piece that Christy Dotson wrote a couple years ago,
Hmm.
in using Black feminism or Black feminist thinking as a way that might put us on the way to decolonization. Um, so how would thinking like an archipelago put us on a path that might prepare us, to change everything in this sense, right? And to think differently, and sufficiently differently, to put us, on this path. And so, in thinking like an archipelago, we find ways to think about things like place and territory in non-sovereign terms.
Hmm.
We find ways to think about the sociality of contact, right? That's beyond the possessive technologies of capture, right? We find ways to think about relation that's not centered around the other as threat, right? All is relation, all is influence. We find ways to ground our political claims and practices in history without deploying history for essentialist projects, right? For a static understanding of sociality. And I suspect that there are other practices and methodologies, that could get us on that path, right? So, for instance, Black feminism, Indigenous feminism. So I don't want to propose at all that creolization is sufficient for this
Hmm.
sort of decolonizing, reorienting. But I do want to say that it's necessary, given the richness of its poetics.
Hmm. Hmm. The point about the archipelago helps me understand more of the argument. Would you say, look, Glissant has the line, I believe in small countries. I'm in favor of small countries in poetics, and which is the central. I mean, I take to be you're working with Traité de tout monde also, but mostly poetics of relation. Um,
Hmm.
and would you say that part of the believing in small countries, the reason you keep the nation, you argue for the nation and creolizing the nation, comes out of an archipelagic sensibility of the small countries that make up an archipelago or different archipelagos? Is that partly informing your argument?
Um, yeah, I mean, and I think there is a way in which one has to be faithful or mindful or ground oneself in that, dare I say, sort of geographical orientation, to even sort of make sense of what creolization is, and how creolization asks us to think about, all these concepts differently, right? So the idea behind the archipelago is, or at least some of the things that get centered, when you think about in these think about think in terms of the archipelago is, right, history, as, fragments or fragmentation, um, uh, creating place, engaging with time, and resituating memory,
Hmm.
in a way that has to deal with these fragments, and dealing with fragmentation that's not about piecing together to reproduce some sort of original whole, um, but a producing so as to move on in time nonetheless.
Hmm.
So I think, right, so it's very much grounded in that creolization. I mean, it's very much grounded in that very specific kind of, geography, right, and the history that comes out of that geography of the small islands.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to remind everybody again to encourage you to post things in the chat. We can get to it in after a few more questions here. I want to return to a point you made about creolization as a method, which is perhaps a slight shift from what we've been talking about politics and ethics and these
Right.
kind of things. I know you were generous enough to share with me a forthcoming chapter you have in a volume on decolonizing American philosophy. And there you speak more specifically about creolization as a tool to theorize resistance. And so wanted to ask you to elaborate on this other level that creolization can work on, this methodological level that we've seen parts of in work to creolize the canon. There's a book
Right.
series on that now. These kind of things. I would be interested in your take on the method of creolization.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And thank you for asking that question. So I should say that that volume, Decolonizing American Philosophy, if I knew it was, I would pull it and put it on display. It actually is already out.
Is it out? Cool.
Yeah, it's out. We received hard copies just last month in January. And it's an amazing collection. I mean, all of the contributors are amazing, and I think it's a really breaking volume.
Hmm.
And so, we're all really grateful to the editors, Corey McCall and Philip McReynolds, for putting together a really good collection of thinking around, right, what it means, all the various ways you can think about decolonizing American philosophy. But to your question about method, right, creolization as method. Interestingly enough, I'm actually currently rereading John Trubinsky's latest book on glissants. Glissants in the Middle Passage, I think is the title. And I think that serves as a pretty good resource to think about this question or this idea of creolization as method. But we also see this being worked out in Mike Monahan's 2012 book, right, Creolizing the Subject, Jane Anna Gordon's book on creolizing Rousseau via Fanon. But I just want to make sure I give those folks the shout out that they deserve. But in any event, right? So as a philosophical method, or maybe even as an invitation for us to think more critically about what counts as method, right? Creolization replaces what one might call, continental thinking for this sort of archipelagic thinking like an archipelago. And then all of that in relation to how we might theorize questions of beginning differently or otherwise, questions of temporality, right? Especially as it relates to, notions of homemaking and placemaking. So for instance, to go back to John Trubinsky, and because this work is fresh in my head, to go back to how he poses these method questions, right? He says, and I'm going to paraphrase, given the modalities of loss and survival that precisely make up Caribbean history, right? That we find in this context of Caribbeanness, a context that asks us to grapple with the materiality of the Middle Passage and the materiality of the plantation. What would it mean for our philosophical method to think to think in these terms, right? And to read human experience in these terms, right? In terms of the shoreline, if you will, is John Trubinsky's phrase. So for our method to adequately ground thinking about the past, the possibility of memory, in the wake of the Middle Passage, right, is what I think creolization, or how I think creolization as a method and as a mode of thinking can be helpful and productive. And so, to say a little bit more, I think so you had a question about, the current work around creolizing the canon. So, on my understanding, so this move to creolizing the canon, likewise, is an attempt to decentralize the methodological assumptions about these sorts of critical questions, right? About time, about what constitutes the human, about the meaning of relations, sociality, history, place, and to decentralize the way those assumptions get shaped if you continue to make your frame of reference Europe, right, or perhaps empire, right? And so to engage with the canon from this creolizing sensibility is to really bring a sort of methodological bricolage, if you will, to bear on the think space out of which the canon operates, right? So that and that I think will often involve engagement with European canonical figures from question sets that and emergent methodologies coming out of life worlds shaped in and against Europe's violence, right? So a move to creolize the canon is about, to my mind, bringing into the canon the experience of empire that so often produce urgencies that require communities on the receiving end of this violence to think quite inventively outside of the colonizing box, if you will, about what it means to be human. And so when you bring those question sets and those experiences to bear on the canon, you get a very different methodological story, and are able to use the canon in very different ways, right, for very different philosophical purposes.
That is helpful, and it recalls the first discussion with David Scott on Stuart Hall, where he said one of the things that Caribbean philosophy so often offers is not just a smart answer to a question, but shifting the set of questions.
Right, exactly. Yes.
Hearing echoes of that here, to use a term Glissant likes. Okay, I want to ask two more questions before we open it up for the chat.
Okay.
First, let's take us back to the politics of some of this, because you end your book, you move through Fanon, and then you end your book, in my mind, very interestingly, for a project of creolizing the nation, which is so let me try to string some of this together. You say at the start of the book, let me quote this to get the language right: the overall effect of creolizing the nation is not to undo the matrices of power that stitch together the governmentality of the state. So acknowledging, I appreciate when books do this, acknowledging the scope of their intervention. And then you end the book with in dialogue with Glenn Coulthard's Redskin White Mass, a critique of the nation state. We can add the state to this key term of the nation. So that beginning and ending made me want to hear more about how you think the relationship of creolization, not just between with the nation, creolizing the nation, but also the state and the nation state.
Yeah. Right. And so, I think the way that this book ended is, sort of mirrors a lot of how most all of my projects end, right? So, I ended this book in the spirit of a new set of interesting and urgent question sets that came to the fore in need of engagement that was beyond the scope of the book, right? And so I ended that book to say that though these questions around the nation and nation states is beyond the scope of the book, part of what the book is holding itself accountable for, if you will, is to at least gesture towards these important questions, right? Despite the fact that it's beyond the scope of the book. And so maybe to explain that move, that tension, if you will, between how I begin and how I end, maybe I'll say a little bit more, say a little bit more about, some more stage setting things about the project, and its relationship to nation, and what that means when it comes to thinking about not just the nation as a sort of everyday experience of nation, but the nation state, right? So as a political project, and I do think I do consider this a political project, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a political project, the frame of the nation allows us to foreground, like I said, the kinds of quite politically salient work that happens at the level of the everyday, right? So those sort of quotidian acts and decisions and gestures, whose efficacy really is about disrupting, even if it's only in that particular moment. It's really about disrupting the habitus, if you will. Those sort of everyday disruptive practices is something that I think is always needs to be considered as political in their own right. Um, but it's also important for us to it's also important, I think, for us to give a proper accounting, if you will, of those disruptive everyday effects, right? And to do that, particularly when we theorize an experience of nations, right? And so, really, my project wants to rethink national life, given the truth, if you will, of these liminal disruptive agencies, a rethinking of nation that problematizes the assumed totality of these matrices of domination, and then offering creolization as a way to name how these quotidian acts of sabotage often make it, if I can put it this way, often make the heart of these technologies of settler colonialism and anti-Black violence pump for the decolonial enterprise. That's a phrase that my dear friend Esme Murdoch shared with me as coming from Wayne Yang's Third University is Possible at a book talk that we actually did earlier on this year. So creolization as a method tries to theorize this in the ways in which communities have always practiced freedom, right, in and against and despite all the varying and intersecting contexts of unfreedom, of which the mechanism of the state is comprised, right? And so, you know, to your question about the states, right, about how this actually relates to the nation at the level of the states, I have to say that this is a genuine gap in the book, and the way I end it is to be honest about marking it as work that needs to follow the book. And so I didn't spend much time at all in the book in delineating how these jostling, creolizing modes of sabotage might manifest itself at the actual level of state mechanisms, right? But I think that's because what I really wanted to do was to offer a lens of national life as it plays out, right, alongside these state machinations of power, in which the landscape of the nation is already being affected by those in the margins, right? And so, you know, without, you know, romanticizing, if you will, what it means to live in the margins and what it means to live under these modalities of domination. And you know, without diminishing the real material effects of what it means to live under that domination, we have to acknowledge, right? And this is what I try to use creolization to do. We have to acknowledge that, you know, these folks in the margins are sort of always already starting shit, right? If we can say it that way, right? Always starting tiny little mini fires on the plantation, right? And so it seems as though, right, there's room to think about how this can all travel up to actual state contesting activities. You know, and the work that Coulthard is doing in his book is a good resource for those questions, right? How this can ground and ultimately condition the possibility of state contesting sort of big R revolutionary actions. But for now, all I have to offer is that, right? So an accounting of what happens at the everyday, without necessarily being able to anticipate or imagine ahead of time, how that might manifest itself in actions, more frontal actions at the level of the state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I wanted to ask one more question that you foregrounded or foreshadowed, I should say, earlier about opacity before we
Right.
turn to the audience questions. And again, I welcome y'all to put things in the chat, and then we'll get to your questions. So, as also somebody who spends a lot of time reading Glissant, opacity is such a difficult concept. By design, likely. I mean, the term might not mean something if it's so clear, but he also
Right.
distinguishes it from obscurity. So here we are trying to make sense of it. And some of the language you use in your book, that it protects the community, that it can guard a community. I'm interested in how you see that working. Is opacity more, does it mean more than cultural difference for you? And how does something like an opacity guard against, you talk about it in terms of the totalitarianism of the one. Can you say more about what it means?
Right. Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, it does seem as though, opacity has, getting a lot of traction in the trenches these days, if you will. And so, I'll be honest here, while doing research for this book and writing about this book, I thought about opacity as doing certain kinds of work, for my overall argument, which is again an argument that says that our accounting of national life ought to grapple with and appropriately theorize with these sort of everyday quotidian jostling activities, right? Um, but and I should say, in talking about the book with others and in reading scholars, now that I'm at the end of the book, right, on the other side of the book, now that the book's completed, it's actually drawn me, right, towards thinking about opacity in perhaps different kinds of ways, right? And I know, that both of us exchanged a couple emails around this particular question. And so, I consider it very much an open and alive question for me, this question of opacity and how we should understand it, and the kinds of work that it can do, both for our theoretical projects and perhaps also for our political projects, or cultural projects even. But, at this juncture, really, between or across the cultural and the political, it is something that I do grapple with, not just at the end of the book, but throughout the book. And so the question, how might we think about Glissant's poetics of relation, supporting or giving way or making possible for a more squarely politics of relation, right? That I think is a question that is very much attendant to this question about opacity, right? How we can think about a poetics of relation or poetics of opacity in a way that can support politics of relation or a politics of opacity, right? And there seems to be a richness of possibilities for that interplay, right? Poetics, opacity as a poetics, and opacity as a politics. There's opacity as refusal. There's opacity as fugitivity, right? I'm thinking here about C. Riley Thornton's work, and Tiffany King's work. Opacity as a kind of illegibility or a refusal of legibility, right? I'm thinking here about, some of the work that Saidiya Hartman has done. So on the question of what opacity is able to achieve, or what it's able to demand, even at the level of politics, um, is one that's very much alive for me. But I do try to tinker around how a response to that question, or what a response to that question would be, um, by precisely turning to thinkers like Fanon and Gunis, in the book. But I do see this question around opacity as one of the number of questions that is really taking me beyond, if you will, the covers of
Hmm.
the book.